You're brought up with this notion that your life is going to be beautiful once this man walks into it. So this man is going to come in and his life is going to become a fairy tale. Of course, I was waiting for that one man to change everything. He didn't change anything. He couldn't even change the bed sheet.
But we are a patriarchal society.
I think it really needs to change quickly. Women are racing faster than patriarchy. And are the men changing? No.
I think I read somewhere that democracy and happy marriages are a myth.
Marriage is the surest way to fall out of love. You marry this guy whom you think is this Greek god, brilliant looking, everything about him is perfect, and he's going to sweep you off your feet and he's going to romance you for life. And then what happens?
So there are a lot of men who are changing.
I really don't want to write about them.
The lives we live versus the truths we don't confront. There are stories we tell the world, and then there are stories we live quietly within ourselves. Stories of who we became, and stories of who we had to be. Sometimes the distance between the two is so subtle that we don't even notice it until something begins to feel off. Today's conversation is not just about books, it is about the spaces they come from, the quiet questions, the inherited emotions, the truths we learn to live with before we ever learn to name them. I am in conversation with Shubha Menon, and this is right in front of me. When I look at your journey from advertising to writing now, it feels like a movement from expression to truth. Did it feel like that to you?
Well, at one level, it does because advertising is an anonymous profession for copywriters, especially because you can write the best campaign ever and nobody will know that you wrote it except those 10 people in the agency. But whereas a book, if you write a book, it's yours. Okay? There is no feedback from any client. Anybody, nobody can tell you change this page, change this line. It's real and it's coming from your life or something that you have seen or experienced or noticed about somebody you know. So it's totally different. It's totally, I would say, writing is really the real thing now that I've written books.
Yeah.
When I sit at my laptop and I'm working on a book, I feel complete.
Yeah. It's a wonderful feeling, also.
Yes.
Yes. So, do you think many of us are living lives that work but don't necessarily feel true?
I would say so. Like if you look at my first book, The Second Coming, which was published by HarperCollins, so there the protagonist is a woman who is she's in an okay marriage. Like there was romance in the beginning and then it's faded away like in all marriages. So either you can accept that life and you can continue in that vein, or you can say that no, life is short, I better do something about it and get out. So in my book, I tried to make her get out of everything. But then again, you see, it's my conditioning also. Because then I said that if she runs away with some other guy or if she leaves her husband and ends the marriage, then it's like judging me. Then when my husband reads it, what is he going to say? Or my brother reads it, what's he going to say? So I very tamely made her go back to her husband.
Yeah. So, your work often sits with people who are doing everything right, and yet something feels missing.
Oh yes,
Why do you think we ignore that feeling for so long?
we ignore that feeling because we are conditioned. So from childhood, you're brought up with this notion that your life is going to be beautiful once this man walks into it. So this man is going to come in and his life is going to become a fairy tale. And so in all the Hindi movies and all the Mills and Bones, you keep reading, and even your mother, chachi, grandmother, everybody says, you have to wait to get married. That's the goal for you. So you have that conditioning. So to break out of it and say that, okay, this doesn't work, takes a lot of courage and takes some time to sink in. That once you get married, then I remember when I got married, there was in our back veranda, there was a wire where the clothes, the woman who came to wash used to put them to dry. And every evening when I came back from work, my job was to pull them off, sort them out, fold them and keep them in the relevant cupboards. And I started to think that this is the routine of my life. Pick up the clothes, put them away. Put them away. Put them in the wash basket, take them out. So it was a big letdown because, of course, I was waiting for that one man to change everything. He didn't change anything. He couldn't even change the bed sheet. So, so yes. So we live like that because we are conditioned. But there are some people who do have the courage to walk away. Just the other day, I have a very dear friend of mine. She told me that she's been telling me for the past 2, 3 years that she wants to get out of her marriage because her husband is drinking. Lately, he's thrown up his job. She has a son who has a mental health problem. There's a lot happening in her life, and she wants to just walk away from it. But did she walk away? No, she did not. She got divorce lawyers to tell her what are her rights and what are his rights. She did everything, but when it was time to step out, she did not. So I asked her, why didn't you do it?
Yeah.
No, because now my son is growing up and he needs
Yeah.
me. So once he grows up, then I'll do it.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to walk out.
It requires a lot of
Yeah,
courage.
because where do you go?
Yeah.
Where do you go? You're a divorced woman or alone woman. Nobody is like looking at you with any sympathy. People are only judging you and saying like bad.
Yeah.
So it's tough.
She must have done something.
Yeah, she must have done something. That's why this happened to her.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's true. So is it fear you feel or is it conditioning?
It's both.
It's both.
Yeah. Initially is conditioning, and then there is fear. See, you can't go back to your parents.
You can't.
Especially if you've had a marriage out of your own choice. You can't tell them because you fought with them and told them that no, this is the guy. You may not like him, but I really like him.
A
this,
fairy
that.
tale.
Yeah. And then, it's very difficult to tell them that I was wrong
Yeah.
or that I'm unhappy because then you consider their feelings. So how are they going to take it if I go back home and there are 2 brothers there or 3 brothers there who are all, looking at you? Then look, she's come back now. She's like an unwelcome visitor because she won't be going back.
Yeah.
So it's
That's true.
difficult. Yeah.
So when you were listening to the stories of these women, what stayed with you the longest?
Are you talking about resilience?
Yes.
So these were very poor women. Most of them lived in the Nizamuddin Basti. If you look at a map of Delhi, you won't even find Nizamuddin Basti on the map. When you go to the Dargah, it's beyond the Dargah. There's one small, dirty, messy little colony with wires hanging down and narrow lanes and these women in burqas. So the story is actually written about these women who are, at 9 years old, they're put into burqas. By 12, 13, they are married. By 14 to 16, they have 2 children. And then they are told talak, talak, talak.
Yeah.
And they come back home to already 3 more sisters are waiting to get married. So there is no money, no agency, nothing, So the book is about these girls. And I went into this whole thing. The only thing I knew about Nizamuddin was the kavalis at the dargah and those Kareem's kebabs. Beyond that, I had no clue, that what am I getting into.
Yeah.
When I met these women, my first thing was that how pathetic, how do they live? I mean, and if I'd go to their homes to interview them and they would give me water, I wouldn't drink it because I didn't know whether it was mineral water or whether it was boiled nothing. I wouldn't eat. I had that kind of, again, conditioning,
Yes.
But by the end of interviewing, I wrote about 11 such women. And then I realized, that they are, one, they are just like me. Secondly, they are far more brave than I am. They are brave, they are radical, they are like fantastic women because they have fought against so many huge odds and they have won. So, it was a great feeling. It was a great feeling just to portray them because they are unknown. No? Who would talk about them
Yes.
till the book came out? Yeah.
So why women? Like why women?
Frankly, I think women are far more interesting and their stories are far richer. And the other reason is that I really don't understand men. I mean, and I really don't even want to understand men because they're so cliche. So that's why. I mean, you look at men. What do they want? They have these big cars. They call them baby and all. And the wife is sitting at home. They're ignoring her because she's become part of some. She's there, and I mean they. I think men, especially in India, are very badly behaved. Like you marry somebody, and once she's in your house, you don't romance her. You don't make her feel good at any time. You expect her to just be there and make the dinner should be hot and round chapatis, that kind of thing. I think they're really typical, especially in my, when I say men, for me it's like the Punjabi male.
Yeah.
That's what I have because I'm a Punjabi. I've grown up with Punjabis. I know those men.
Yes.
So I know how much full of patriarchy they are.
Yeah.
And I really don't want to write about them.
Yeah.
Women are great.
But we are a patriarchal society.
Yes, we are.
We are. And
Yeah.
what is your take on that?
On a patriarchal society,
Yeah.
I think it really needs to change quickly because women are racing faster than patriarchy. Women are changing so much. How many women have joined the workforce? So many women are, breaking out. And are the men changing? No. They still want their round chapati. They still want, everything done for them. They still don't help wives out in the house. They think it's their birthright to just sit there and be, served. So men are not changing, but women are changing very quickly. So that's what my take on patriarchy, that it will be smashed sooner than later.
So there are a lot of men who are changing, and I see it from personal experience now that people are like becoming conscious
Yeah.
to waking up to taking care of a child, or even some of them giving opportunities to their wives to come forward. But do you think you're still at the roots they are different?
Yeah, I think these men are exceptions. Like in my entire life, I've met one man who said that he will be the house husband because his wife had a very ambitious streak and she wanted to be the CEO. He said, okay, I'll sit at home, I'll look after the house and child. I'm not that ambitious, you go. Only one man I've met. So they may be changing, but it's not.
It's a long way to
It's
go.
a long way to go,
It's
right?
a long way to go. Right. So, when you were listening to the stories of these women, not as a writer, but as a person, what is it that stayed with you? Like, something it stayed with you for so many years. And
Well, definitely one thing that stayed with me was that, I never really thought about privilege. I didn't think I came from a very privileged background. I thought I was just normal, not terribly rich, but not poor either, middle class. But when I met these women, I just realized how privileged I am. These women, so many of them didn't go to school, or if they went, they were withdrawn after class 5 because the Maulvis didn't want them to go to school. They were married off without being asked if they want to get married. They were thrown out after talaq, talaq, talaq without being asked again. And just makes you think that here I am, Nizamuddin Basti, and where I live in GK, how much distance is there? Not much. But there I'm doing my masters in English, and here they are like, they are just doing nothing, just getting beaten up by husbands,
yeah,
that kind of thing. Just that privilege, the thing of how fortunate I am, and I should never, think that I'm, going through something bad, or my life is not good, because I also suffer from a mental illness. But this made me realize that whatever it is, I'm so much better off than so many.
yeah.
Yeah.
But men really don't know also that they've been conditioned in such a way by the mothers.
By the mothers.
By the mothers also. Like I have seen my father also. I mean, I am on a public platform, but yet I'm saying. So my father never used to get up to get a glass of water. And because he was the eldest, and that is like an entitlement, right?
Yeah,
The
yeah.
eldest, and he will not do any work.
Yeah. And even if you've been to office all day,
Yeah.
and the man has just sat and watched TV all day, still he won't get up to take that water. Because why should he? There's someone who'll do it.
Yes, that's the conditioning we have. So, what stayed longest with you, not as a writer, but as a person?
So I met uh, 11, I met maybe 12 or 13 women in the course of writing Resilience, which is true stories of Muslim women, most of whom who lived in Nizamuddin Basti, and how their life changed when a social activist took up their cause and started teaching them. So the thing is that the social activist did not just teach them in school like ABC and all that. She would have classes on what is patriarchy and how gender makes such a difference and what is equality. And she would have these sessions in class, and girls would answer. They were very bright, some of the girls, so they turned out to be very different when they grew up. What they taught their daughters and granddaughters was very different. So I saw another side to the world which I had never seen, because I come from a background of privilege, more or less. And, I took it for granted that everybody goes to school, everybody goes to college, everybody has jobs, lead their life. But here I found there were girls who had to fight to go to school because they were banned from going to school. Like the Maulvi would, when they were going to school, the Maulvis would, if they saw a girl going to the school, they would hit them on the head.
Oh
You
my
know,
God.
yeah, but this was in the 1980s where this book has been set. So this is the one thing that stayed with me, and the other thing that stayed with me, that I realized that while I think that I'm very cool and Delhi University and all that, but actually I'm not, because for the longest time while writing this book, it was they and me. So they were the other, and I always was somebody who was little above or away, and it took me a slow letting go to actually feel that we are on the same level, because we are all women, and at the bottom of everything our problems are just the same. So I may not have been stopped from going to school, but there are many other things I was also stopped from. And yeah, so it was like an equalizer, leveler. Yeah.
So you also work with mental illnesses and
Yes.
helping people and also people writing stories of their lives. So with these women, one very important thing is security in our head, right? A very important fundamental right. I feel that you should feel secured in an environment. But what about them? I'm sure from childhood they never felt secure because they were never in such an environment, even after marriage and that fairy
Yeah.
tale.
So
So
I think what gave them security, one, was to be able to stand on their own feet. Because once they went through this schooling with Shabnam Hashmi, the woman who ran that school, uh, she also made them capable and referred them to places where they could find jobs. Now, this made a huge difference, because when you don't have to depend on your husband or father-in-law for money, then that's a beautiful kind of independence and security. So that's I think the main way they became secure, because if they wanted to walk away, they could rent a room for themselves.
yes.
In fact, one of the women, she wanted to get married, and she told Shabnam that, you find me a guy. So Shabnam met somebody and introduced the guy to this girl. And this girl, she quizzed him, like, I will not do this. You will have to help me in all the chores. You will have to let me study as much as I feel like. And he agreed to everything. And then only she married him. So that kind of security comes from within, and it's beautiful.
In a lot of ways, I've met a lot of women who are their own limitations,
Yes.
mentally or otherwise also. I have seen because of the conditioning or something, because it's secured part of our life when things are, I mean, these were not privileged women, but there are a lot of privileged women who still feel trapped.
Yes.
What do you feel that, what does that say for a
See,
society and
the
women?
thing is, everybody's life has a struggle. When you are poor, your struggles may look different than that of the rich woman, but everybody has struggles.
Yeah.
It's just that when you live in a ghetto like the Nizamuddin Basti, your struggles are visible to everybody, because the houses are cheek to jowl. And if you stand on the terrace, you can see everybody's homes, and it's all very open. But the richer women, their problems get hidden behind a
Big
mask
houses.
where they act very normal, but nobody knows what is going on behind, and they're terribly unhappy and not really able to do much about it. But then there are women who do something about it also. So it's up to you to keep yourself inspired and to keep your eyes on what is it that you really want and go for it.
So your latest work feels like it moves even deeper into the mind, into childhood, into what we carry without choosing.
Yes. So my latest work is called Traitor in the House, and it's the story of my bipolar life. So my mother was severely bipolar, and we are five siblings. We all inherited it from her in different ways. And no, that kind of unwell mother was not a choice. I mean, she came. I mean, it was karma, I guess, that we were born to her. And yes, it was a very difficult life. As a child, I have never been so frightened of anybody more than her. And it was like a nightmare. All that, it was like a living a 24/7 nightmare. That's how it was. And for a child, you don't understand that this is an illness. You just think, everybody's mother is so different. Why is mine like this?
Yes.
And you are just kind of trapped in that, because what do you do about it? But luckily for me, I had a way out of that trap, because I had a absolutely wonderful father. You know, he gave us so much love.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of love, and that kind of saved me. I would think I'm alive because of him.
So when did you get to know that your mother is bipolar? When was it detected?
Actually, I didn't know for the longest time, because it was a long time back. So in the 60s and all, when she actually got diagnosed also, there was very little knowledge about bipolar disorder or mental health. I mean, Sigmund Freud was also like 20th century only, na.
Yeah.
So the psychiatry is pretty young as a study or a profession. So she got diagnosed, but nobody really put a label on it. And they were doctors, but they were very tentative. The medicines themselves were unknown, in the sense people knew which medicines to give, but they were not so much aware of what kind of side effect will happen to which person. There was really no proper cure. So we all I knew was that my mother goes high and she goes low at different times, but I didn't have a name for it. It's only when I was much older. But one more thing, there was no Google at that time or Chat GPT. You couldn't just put it there and say, these are the symptoms, what does my mother have?
Yeah. Yeah.
It wasn't there. So yeah, as a label, no, I didn't know. But as a child, I knew there was something terribly wrong with her.
But somebody who already knows that they have this disorder, what is the biggest challenge?
Well, I have this disorder that every day is a challenge.
Yeah.
And biggest challenge, I think the biggest challenge is for those who get psychotic symptoms.
Okay.
For them it's really bad. So there are people who get symptoms where they lose touch with reality. You know. So, for instance, they can be sitting in a plane and they'll ask the air hostess, "Where is the flight going?" They don't know. Or they'll hear voices telling them, "You go downstairs and just jump in front of a car because you're not worth living." Somebody is telling them, and they'll go. Or I know of people. There's a guy I know who thought he was Jesus, and then he was trying to walk on the water. I mean, he would have died, no?
Yeah.
So these people who kind of get out of touch with reality because of the illness, I think theirs is the biggest risk. The rest of us, like me, we go up and down, and then with medication, we are much better. So since I started, so either you take, depending on the kind of bipolar you have, you will be given antidepressants,
Yeah.
and you'll also be given something called a mood stabilizer. So once you're on a mood stabilizer, most of us have become very functional. Like if you look at me, you can't really say that I have a severe mental illness. So that's of course because I've perfected all the masks, but also because I have this mood stabilizer, which keeps me well. But there are some people I know, even in my family, with this kind of psychotic symptoms. It's difficult.
But was it hard for you to accept it?
Well, I've accepted it. The other day, I was talking to somebody, and they said that wouldn't it be a much better life for you if you were Shubha minus bipolar disorder? So I thought about it and I said, no, that's part of my identity. If I don't have bipolar disorder, then I don't know who I am. So no, I wouldn't want to throw it away, or I wouldn't want to change it at all. I have accepted it. My mother had it, and she was so bizarre because she didn't have medication.
Yeah.
She didn't have treatment. So it kept getting worse. But throughout childhood and growing up, my one thought was that anything can happen, but I can't be like her. And I'll never be like her. And I had brainwashed myself and said, no, I'm not like her. I will, like none of that will be part of my life. So when the doctor told me that you have bipolar disorder, I said, no, I don't have it. I don't have it. And he told me, you take, because I had 2 episodes of depression. And when I had the third one, he told me, I'll add a mood stabilizer. I told him, no, I'm fine. I don't have it. I know I just don't have that gene. It's not there in me. And I didn't believe. I did not want to believe. And I did not take the mood stabilizer till I again flopped and again went into depression. And then I started taking it. And that actually just stabilized me. So, if bipolar is like high, low, when you're on the mood stabilizer, you'll go little high, then little low, little high. So, you're much in
Intensity is
control.
not so much.
You're very much in control. And they also say that as you get older, the symptoms become less.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For all mental illnesses, they say, that it kind of fades away a little bit at least.
So when a child grows up in an emotionally unpredictable environment, what do you think they learn about love?
About love, I think they really learn what it is like to not be loved, you know. Because my mother, because she was unwell, she would always tell me that you are useless. You have no redeeming feature. You're ugly. You don't have any brains. You will never be successful, and no one will ever marry you. And she would all the time say that to me, till I really thought that something is wrong with me. But I knew also that there is nothing really wrong. But these things, they in your subconscious, they get,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I mean, for the longest time, I thought that I'm very ugly. And then just a couple of months ago, I was going through old family pictures, and then I saw a picture of mine. I said, such a cute girl. And then I said, that's me. I said, how could I think I'm ugly? But I did. I did. So that is the kind of thing. So when you get that something like that from your mother, then you can't love her either.
Yes.
So it's both ways, right? So I really thought I wanted her to just die because she was such a problem for me. Like she'd come to my school. You know how school is. It's like everybody is, looking, and there's a lot of peer pressure. And she'd come to my school in some rubbish clothes and talk to my teachers and say, I'm withdrawing her today.
Yeah.
So I would feel like dying. She'd like just disappear.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's so really
Must
so.
be really
I
hard.
mean, I think love is something which comes when it's a give and take. It can't be that you be really mean to somebody and they love you back. I don't think that happens,
Yes.
right? So my dad's love was unconditional, and so my love for him was totally unconditional. Like he could say anything, he could want anything from me, and I was there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But for my mother, no.
So, like in India, especially, parents are our ideals. And we grow up with the voices of our parents in our head. We, a lot of times that I've seen myself, like I have my father's voice in my head, which did also, I kept beating myself up many a times till I got out of the loop. So whose voice was in your head when you were growing up?
I think for me it was my own voice, because my mother's voice was there, always telling me that you are like a hopeless person who should kill herself. She tell me, go to the terrace and jump, I'll come with you. So just to overpower that voice, there was a voice which in me which kept saying, no, there's nothing wrong with you. No, you don't have to go and jump off. No, you don't know how to cook, but you'll still be fine. No, you she can say what she wants, but there is a lot more to you than she says. So just hang in there, you're going to be fine. So I think it was my own voice.
So your father, what did he used to say for when your mother used to be referring to these?
Well, see, he would go to work from morning till night,
Yeah.
and I don't think he really knew what exactly she was telling us, you know. But he was extremely patient with her. He never once said that she should be put away into a home because she was that bad. She should have been put away, but he did not. And he tried everything possible to get her well, no, doctors, medicines, pundits, Maulvis, you name it. He did that, and I feel he was just wonderful, because it is so easy to discard a person like that.
Absolutely,
No?
yeah.
But he didn't do it.
Yeah. And what about your siblings? Were they a big support?
No, I think we were all trying to somehow save ourselves.
Okay. At different levels, yeah.
Yeah.
And what do you think the children learn about themselves in such an environment?
I think children learn that I may be alone. I don't have a mother to hold my hand and teach me and guide me through many things. But I am enough. I am strong. I can fight back, and whatever it is, I will overcome. I have learned that.
You've done it well. So the title Traitor in the House stays with you because it doesn't point outwardly immediately that, what is a traitor you feel, in the mind.
Yeah. So for me, the traitor in the house is my mother, because which mother wants her children to jump off from the roof? So a mother's supposed to be someone who comforts you when you get hurt, or every night sings you a little lullaby and puts you to bed, kisses you good night. And my mother was nothing, not even near that remotely. So she was like a traitor, because she was the mother, but she was nothing like the mother. So it was like she was somebody else who had been planted. And so definitely I started the book by writing that to me, she is the traitor in the house. But after growing up and after myself going through the same illness and realizing that it was an illness that made her like that, that is not something that she hated me or she was out to get me. These were my childhood sentiments. But when I grew up, I realized that she was possibly the most pathetic creature on earth, because she didn't get treatment. So, how can I hold something against that kind of lady? She just had hell through her life. And once I did that, then I realized that she's not the traitor in the house. It's that gene which got mutated in her system, which is the traitor. She was just a victim.
Yeah. But were you angry about all these things?
Yes.
How
Yes.
did you deal with that?
I was very angry. I used to tell both my older sisters, and they would be very aghast. I would keep saying that, I wish she was dead. And I mean, see, it's difficult. You can only get angry, but you have to hold that anger in yourself, because you can't fight with someone who is so violent and so dangerous, and you're just a kid.
Yeah.
So that anger was something I internalized and ate up.
Yes, that's what. So that
Yeah.
anger must have, changed and shaped your personality in so many ways.
Well, yes. What happened for the good thing that happened for me, that is that I somewhere along the way I stumbled into Buddhism, and I started praying and chanting, and that changed my inner makeup. mental makeup, because instead of holding her responsible and blaming her for making my life like a mess and hell, I started treating her like this lady who needed a lot of love actually. And I became her best caregiver. By then I was married, I had my own child and all that. I started going and visiting her, spending time with her, buying her new clothes, getting her favorite foods, just chatting with her, just kind of trying to make her feel better. So yeah, that anger actually turned into some kind of
Compassion.
love. Yeah.
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 So, do you think at times we become strangers to ourselves in ways we don't even recognize?
Yes, I think so. We do. It's the way life shapes us. Like, like we were talking about these women who are trapped in situations which are not of their own making, but they are not able to get out. So that's the way it is. Like that girl I mentioned who wants to get out, can get out if she really wants to, but is unable to, because she's riddled with all this guilt. She's going to leave this drunk man. What if he dies? What about her son? She's going to take him away. He'll be a product of a broken home. Who will be responsible? These things are, so she becomes this submissive woman who goes to work, comes back, weeps herself to sleep every night, you know?
There's a lot of loneliness and a lot of invisibility in such situations where people are misaligned.
Yes.
And this misalignment really causes a lot of issues in most of the marriages these days that we feel because we are too scared to choose
Yes.
and take a
Absolutely.
path.
Mm.
So, do you want to say something to these women? That
I really don't think I can say much because it's a individual thing. So there is no one way to tackle this. So if you're not compatible with your partner and it's making your life hell, is it good to walk away from him or is it good to stay on in the same house? It's a very personal equation, right? I cannot tell them what to do.
yes,
I mean, yeah, how can I? There's
yeah,
so many different women, so many different personalities. I think then it's best is to go for therapy
yeah.
and really talk it out, and maybe even couples therapy. Really go and abuse each other, take out all that anger, and then see, is there any common way? Is there any way to get together, stay together, or no? And then part amicably if you have to.
But do you think in such situations people fall out of love?
Definitely, see, marriage is the surest way to fall out of love.
I like that line. I'm gonna use that.
But it's true. It's true. See, you marry this guy whom you think is this Greek god,
Yeah.
brilliant looking. Everything about him is perfect. And he's going to sweep you off your feet and he's going to romance you for life. And then what happens? Then you see him sitting on the pot, his undies around his ankles, he's farting, pooping. Wow, you can't stay in love with that. You can maybe be friends a little. You can maybe, have affection, but that romantic love will not stay. That is just an illusion. I mean, I sound so cynical, but I actually believe that it's an illusion. Maybe out of 10 crores, there's one couple who stays completely in love.
I did hear somewhere, I think I read somewhere that democracy and happy marriages are a myth.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You feel that? So, how do we hold compassion for the people who shaped us while also acknowledging what it did to us?
Well, I think prayer really helps. I'm serious. All my life, I did not pray because I really didn't believe in it. And my family was such that my mother never taught us things like this, no prayer or going to temples or taking us to any religiously related activities, nothing. And my grandfather, grandmother, we didn't live with them. So we really didn't know. And then I was sitting one day in a function in my colony. They were celebrating Lodi or something. They have this little function. So I was sitting with my head like that, and there was a woman sitting next to me. And she said, "You look so disturbed. What happened to you?" So I told her, I have this going on. She said, "I'll pray for you." And she called me the next day. "I prayed for you. Are you feeling better?" She called me in the evening also. That today I sat and prayed 2 hours for you. I hope you're feeling better. And I actually started feeling better. And then, when she said, would you like to join this Buddhism? I said, sure. I had never encountered this kind of selfless, absolute stranger, wanting to help me and actually doing something about it, not just saying it. And then I took up chanting, and I think it's made a wonderful difference to my life because it fills you with positive feelings, and it also, it makes you start questioning right from wrong. So slowly, 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 you change. And that change is a great thing. For instance, like the Buddha says that if you want to hit somebody, you want to take revenge, and you're holding a piece of coal, burning coal to throw at them, but your hand is getting burnt, right? So that is the problem with revenge and anger. And so once these kind of things make you question that, am I doing the right thing? Should I change my attitude a little? And it's a happier existence
Yeah.
internally.
Calmer also.
Yes, calmer also.
So, is understanding enough to heal the scars, the wounds?
I think understanding coupled with love, there has to be love. So if it doesn't have to be love from someone in your environment, a husband, a mother, anybody. It can be self-love,
Okay.
and that is enough. Yeah, understanding plus love.
Okay. What is something you still don't fully understand about yourself?
About myself. Well, I find that I don't know how to kind of project myself. I have a lot going for myself. I've done so much in my life, but I'm always kind of hiding behind somewhere. I don't push myself in the limelight. If someone says, you've done so much, go and talk about it. These days, the only way to get ahead is to talk about it and this and that. I'm not able to do it. I'm very kind of withdrawn that way, and I don't understand why. I don't know why. It's part of my personality. I think somewhere my mother's voice is still talking to me saying, you are useless. So I cannot make myself stand there and say, I'm great.
So, thank you. Thank you so much for coming on this podcast right in front of me. And I'm very, very grateful that we had you here.
Yeah.
And thank
Let's
you so
talk
much.
again without the
We
mics.
must. We should. Yes.
Yeah.
There's so much to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe the work is not always to find answers, but to become more honest about the questions we are living with. And maybe in that honesty, something begins to soften, something begins to make sense, or at least something begins to feel less alone. This was a conversation with Shubha Menon, and this is right in front of me.